Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Agronomy in Action Insight series. We're very excited to have you here with us this morning. We have an hour packed of agronomy content here for you today. Today's webinar is going to be about where does yield come from, and it's really going to focus in on corn and corn yield. With that being said, we will get right into it here this morning. I want to introduce our two presenters that will be on with us. We have Steve Wilkins, who is our Eastern Agronomy Manager here at Golden Harvest. Another thing about Steve is he actually was one of this year's NCGA, the National Corn Grower Association winners. And so hopefully he can bring some of the insight that he had from his farm and showcase that all with us today. The other person is we welcome back Brad Bernhardt. Brad is the agronomic research scientist that was with us the first week of the series here this year. So we welcome him back and appreciate him joining us this morning. With that being said, I'm actually going to pass it right on to Brad to get us started with content. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here once again. If we're going to talk about yield, we first need to think about the corn yield equation. So I've got a poll question here, and the question is, which of the following represents the corn yield equation? You have a couple different selections there, but all of them will include ears per acre, kernels per ear, and then the last component of that yield equation is it test weight, kernel weight, or kernel weight and test weight. Or you could also select that you don't know, which is why you're here today. Lucky for you, you'll be finding out the answer in about less than a minute here. Okay, so the results of the poll question, we have a little bit of variety of everything, but the majority, at least 51% of you, selected the second one there, ears per acre, kernels per ear, and kernel weight. And for those 51% of you, you will be correct. The corn yield equation is that plants per acre, kernels per ear, and then the weight of each of those individual kernels. Test weight is not part of the corn yield equation. It has its place, but not in the yield equation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if you think about these three components, these are the components that you're measuring if you're to do a yield estimate in your field in August before harvest, trying to get an estimate of what your yield might be. You'll be counting the ears, the number of ears, harvestable ears, the kernels on those ears, and then estimating the weight of each individual kernel. But there is one of these that the grower has the most control over, and that is plants per acre, because you physically have to plant the plants. We can alter kernels per ear and weight per kernels with different management, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the one we have the most control over today is plants per acre. This graph here is the historical U.S. average grain yield and seeding rate. This is the U.S. average. So first, I want to focus on that blue line there. That's the U.S. average seeding rate dating back to 1960s. And you look there in the 1960s, we were averaging between around 17,000 plants per acre was our seeding rate. Compared to today, we're around 33, 34, 35,000 plants per acre seeding rate. Again, that's the U.S. average. So going from across the past decades, we're averaging about 400 more plants per acre per year. The orange line there would be the U.S. average corn yield, and it follows a very similar trend. Continues to increase yields over the decades. This year, we actually set a new U.S. average corn yield record at 279.3 bushels per acre. Now, if you attended this webinar last year, you may remember Steve predicting we were going to see a new world U.S. average record in yield, and we did achieve that. He was basing that off of years that end in 4, so 1994, 2004, 2014, and then now 2024. All those years that ended in 4, we set a new U.S. average corn yield record. So, the real take home of this slide is make sure you follow Steve for all your corn marketing needs. Although I did ask him what 2025 is going to look like, and he declined to comment. So I think he's holding some information from us there. So thinking about the other two components, kernel number and kernel weight, here is the correlation between grain yield and kernel number on the left, and grain yield and kernel weight on the right. And not really surprising here, there is a strong correlation between grain yield and more kernels. If you have more kernels, you're going to have higher grain yield. Similarly, if you have higher kernel weights, you're going to have higher grain yield. So nothing too surprising there on the correlation between those yield components and grain yield. But what about the correlation between kernel number and kernel weight? So there really is no relationship. They are not correlated with each other. So you could have a lot of kernels, but they could be heavy or they could be light. And vice versa, you could have a few kernels, and those kernels could be either heavy or light. And one of the main driving factors on why there's no strong correlation between kernel number and kernel weight is due to yield component compensation. And yield component compensation is if you have more kernels on your ear or more kernels in the field, it just takes a lot more resources and energy to fill those additional kernels. So the kernels typically tend to be a little bit lighter. Compared to if you had less kernels per ear, that's less kernels to fill. Those kernels tend to be a little bit heavier. So there's a lot of yield component compensation going on, a little bit challenging. Now, if we really want to achieve high yields and take yields to the next level, it would be really nice if we could have a lot of kernels and have all of them be heavy. So a correlation between kernel number and kernel weight. But I'll just walk through a couple examples here. So I got three different yield environments here and looking at the relationship between how kernel number may affect that and how kernel weight may affect that. So we got 200 bushel, 230 bushel, and 260 bushel. In this example here, I kept the number of plants per acre the same, 34,000 plants per acre. And I also kept the kernel weight the same, and that is the 85,000 kernels per bushel. So in this example, I am expressing kernel weight in a kernels per bushel format. So it takes 85,000 kernels to produce a bushel, another way of saying a kernel weight. And we'll express it as that quite a bit throughout this presentation. So just remember that that is the number of kernels to produce a bushel. If you have less kernels to produce a bushel, that means those kernels were heavier. If it took more kernels to produce a bushel, that means the kernels were lighter. So again, just related to kernel weight. So for this example, I kept that plants per acre the same, the weight per kernel the same. The only thing I changed is the number of kernels per plant. So if you're trying to achieve 200 bushel corn, and if your ear is producing 510 kernels per plant, that's roughly a 16 by 32. That will get you about 200 bushels. If you could get just four more kernels each row lengthwise on that ear, just four more, you can gain another 30 bushels without changing anything. Similarly, there, if you got a 16 by 41 ear, you can get up to 260 bushels. So it sounds so simple, just four more kernels, you can get 30 bushels an acre. But as we all know, it's a lot more challenging than that. So similarly here, now this example, I'm going to keep the kernels per plant the same. So they're all at 540 kernels per plant. The only thing changing here is kernel weight, going from 90,000 kernels per bushel or lighter kernels down to 70,000 kernels per bushel or heavier kernels. So again, when you're doing your yield estimates in your field, the general rule of thumb is use 90,000 kernels per bushel. But, as we all know, there's a big range in that. And just a slight change in your kernel weight can have a big impact on yield. So we've probably all seen this graph or heard of this kind of explanation before. We're all aware of this. So the different timings or different growth stages throughout the year and when ear development is determined. So early on in the growing season, up to about V6 to V8, that is when the number of rows around that the ear is developing, and that is when that is determined. The ear length, or how many kernels per row that ear is going to produce, that's usually determined between that V6 to V8 stage, all the way up to pollination and even after pollination, because kernels can always abort. You may be aborting kernels during the grain fill period at the tip of that ear. So that ear length is determining for a much greater period of time. And lastly, their kernel weight, well, that is all determined during that grain fill period. So after pollination up through black layer. So we've all probably seen this before, but probably may not be aware of where some of this data or information was collected to produce this kind of a chart. And so there's a lot of different research that's been done on this, but one of the common ones that's awfully done, and one that is commonly referred to that was published in the 80s, was they looked at different stresses on the plant, different timings of those stresses, and how that impacted that ear development. So they were specifically using shading. So they shaded the crop during the vegetative stages. Notice that it was producing less kernels around, or less kernel length, or less ear length. They also did shading during the grain fill period, and notice those kernels were lighter. So that's some of the historical research that's been done that produced some of this kind of a chart here. Now, the agronomy research team, we did a similar study this year with a little different focus. We've all been well aware that wildfire smoke has been more common through the last couple of seasons. And the question is often, with the wildfire smoke potentially reducing light levels, what kind of impact does that have on yield? Well, wildfire smoke is challenging to replicate in a field or mimic in a field, as you probably are well aware. So we did the best we could. We were using shade tents that would limit about 50% of the light. And we weren't really trying to mimic the smoke exactly, but mostly focusing on the different timings. If we were to get wildfire smoke, what timing would it have the biggest impact on yield? So very similar study that was done in the 80s looking at the impact of solar radiation intensity on yield. So here's the results from that. So we had three different shade timings. We had a no shade, we had a shade during the vegetative stages, shade during pollination, and shade during the reproductive stages. And we put the shade tents out for a 3-week period during each of those timings. So you can see there with no shade, the average yield was about 284 bushels an acre. When we put shade during that vegetative stages, significantly impacted yield down to about 160. And if we put shade during the pollination timing or the reproductive stages, it was even a more significant impact on yield. Now let's focus a little bit on the yield components there. So no shade, we were getting about 655 kernels per ear and about 11.8 ounces per 1,000 kernels. So that's the kernel weight on ounces per 1,000 kernels. If we look at that shading during that vegetative time, significantly reduce the number of kernels per ear. So again, when that ear is being developed during the vegetative stages, any stress in this particular case, shade, significantly reduced kernels per ear. Now you'll notice that it indirectly increased kernel weight, so higher kernel weight, because again, there was just less kernels to fill. During pollination timing, our most critical timing of where we don't want any stress on the plant. If we were shading that corn plant during that timing, that's where we had the biggest reduction in kernel number. We just didn't get the pollination that we needed. And again, indirectly increased kernel weight. During the reproductive stages, we had a slight decrease in kernel number compared to no shade, and a lot of that was kernel abortion at the tip, but a minimal impact on the number of kernels per plant. The big impact there was was that kernel weight. During that grain fill period, any kind of stress will reduce that kernel weight within that year. Here's just a picture of what those ears look like this year. So the ears on the left would have been no shade. Those second pair of ears there is shade during the vegetative stages. You can see that reduced the number of kernels around, just didn't produce as big of ears. Shade during pollination, you can also see much smaller ears, fewer kernels. We had a lot of it that just didn't get pollinated. And those ears on the right there was shade during the reproductive stages. Pretty good size ears, but you can see there was some tip back at the top, some kernels aborted, and then also those kernels turned out to be very, very light. So what about the difference between hybrids? So we all know that not all hybrids are created equal. So we actually take grain samples from all of our hybrids every year, and we will take and weigh, and we'll count out 1,000 kernels. We'll weigh them. We'll adjust that weight to 15.5% grain moisture. And then from that, we can calculate individual kernel weight, and we can then put that into a kernels per bushel. But there's a big effect on environment, so we try our best to adjust for that year effect. And I'll kind of walk through a little bit of that here. So this graph here is the past couple years that we've been doing this. And again, this is expressed as kernel weight in kernels per bushel. Again, less kernels per bushel means those kernels were heavier. So the blue dots there would be the average across all the hybrids that we had that year and all the locations. So you can see in 2016, 2017, and 2018, we were averaging, around 80,000 kernels per bushel. In the last couple years, we were more in the 90,000 kernels per bushel range on average. But if you look at those orange bars, that's the range that we were getting between the different hybrids and locations. So you can see just there in 2023, going from 136,000 kernels per bushel down to 77,000 kernels per bushel. So very, very large range. It is not only environment dependent, but also hybrid dependent. Here's just another way to show the variability in kernel weight that we've been seeing in these samples that we've been taking. So on the bottom is all of the site years or locations and years that we've been pulling these samples from. The bars are color coded by location. So for example, that first set of orange bars there was all in Brookings, South Dakota, just different years. The blue bars would have all been in Clinton, just different years. And so I want to kind of focus on the Stanton, Minnesota location, that last set of orange bars there, just to show you just, even at a given location, same geography, the range in kernel weights that we're getting depending on the year. It is so environmentally dependent, going from 74,000 bushel kernels per bushel in 2016 to up to 131,000 kernels per bushel in 2022. I actually had to look back and see what went on at that location in 2022 to see why we had such light kernels there. Well, actually, they experienced a pretty significant drought in central Minnesota that year. I think they're averaging between 6 and 8 inches of rain, less rain during the grain fill period. So again, just didn't have the resources to fill those kernels, ended up with very light kernels. The last thing I want to draw the attention to is that last bar there, the location average. So across all our hybrids, all the locations, we're averaging roughly 90,000 kernels per bushel. And if you think about the old rule of thumb, when you're doing your yield estimates, that was typically the number to use was 90,000 kernels per bushel. But again, a very, very large range depending on the environment. Well, what about the hybrid? Similar story when it comes to hybrid. So I'm not going to focus in on any given hybrid here, but really what I want to show is the range in the difference between just the genetic heritability of how these hybrids produce kernels and kernel size. So those hybrids on the left there, on average, they will just throw bigger, heavier kernels. Compared to the hybrids on the right, they tend to throw lighter kernels, not as big of kernels, but generally typically have a lot more kernels per ear. So I want to focus in on just a couple select hybrids here. So I just specifically that same graph, I just pulled out the U series hybrids that we have, and just want to point out a few here. So G94U63, G98U62, and G12U11. Those three hybrids, they just genetically produce heavier, bigger kernels compared to maybe a G08U98 or a G05U86. They just tend to produce lighter kernels. Doesn't mean they're low yielding hybrids. It just means they produce lighter kernels. Usually that means they'll have more kernels per ear. So one way to use this data is I like to use it is utilizing that blue bar there. That blue bar is the percent of the location mean. So again, not all these hybrids are at all locations. So that blue bar is at a given location where that hybrid's at, how heavy or how light are those kernels compared to the average at that location. So the average would be 100%. So if you're above 100%, it means you're typically throwing heavier kernels. If you're below 100%, you're typically throwing lighter kernels. So on a given year, if I was doing a yield estimate in my field in August, and I would like to think about the year that we're having during that grain fill period. Has it been a good season or has it been a poor season? So if it's been a good season, instead of using 90,000 kernels per bushel average, I may use 80,000 kernels per bushel average. And then I look at that blue bar there and I say, hey, this hybrid that's in the field, it generally produces heavier kernels. So maybe I'm going to use 75,000 kernels per bushel. But if I'm in a field that has a hybrid that generally throws lighter kernels, well, maybe I'll adjust it a little bit higher to 85 or 90,000 kernels per bushel. So that's one way that we can utilize this kind of information that we're collecting. So last thing I want to touch on before I turn it over to Steve is ear flex. So we've all heard of hybrids having either a determinant ear or more of a flex ear. And that flex ear would be a hybrid that can adjust its ear size or yield potential based off of the environment, whether that's flexing positively because it has favorable growing conditions, or it could also flex negatively if it's under more stress compared to a determinant ear that may be more stable across more environments. So in this particular trial, what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify hybrids that can capture additional yield potential under favorable growing conditions through ear flex. And so the way we did that is, to create favorable growing conditions, we selected irrigated sites, and then we also planted them at an optimal seeding rate and then a suboptimal seeding rate. And that suboptimal seeding rate under irrigation was our favorable growing conditions. So the plants have a lot of room. So it just kind of simulates a good environment and see what kind of yield potential can be added through ear flex between these hybrids. So we looked at a couple different hybrids and trying to determine where the ear flex is coming from. And ear flex, there's really three different ways. You can get more kernels per row. You could also get more kernel length of that ear. Or the last type of ear flex would be increase in kernel size. And ear flex through kernel size is really that hidden yield potential. That's one that you're not necessarily going to see walking through a field, looking at how hybrid ear flex is. You may see bigger ears, longer ears, but it's hard to see the difference in kernel size in terms of ear flex. So for this study, we selected hybrids that had a diverse background. So some of them are newer hybrids, some of them may be a little bit older hybrids, and trying to get a proof of concept of it is, can we characterize these hybrids in their ear flex source, and is it repeatable through multiple years and growing seasons? So here are the different hybrids that we tested and where the source of ear flex was coming from. So the blue part of those bars would mean the majority of that ear flex is coming through kernel number, and the orange bar would be that ear flex is coming through kernel weight. And so there's a couple hybrids that really flex through kernel weight, and that is G03B19, G10L16, and G16K01. Those three hybrids really flex through ear flex or through kernel weight compared to G06B57, 14B65, and 17A81. Those hybrids in good growing conditions are going to be flexing through kernel number. Here's just a one example side by side of how that kind of looked when we've sampled these ears. So that first hybrid there on the top is G16Q82 under optimal seeding rate compared to suboptimal seeding rate, or that favorable growing environment. And that hybrid, you can see under favorable growing conditions, that hybrid is flexing through kernel number. It is producing bigger ears. There are more kernels on those ears. Compared to that bottom one there, G16K01, that one, as you go from optimal seeding rate to suboptimal, or that favorable growing condition, you really don't see much difference there in ear size. But again, all that flex is coming through kernel weight, which you're not necessarily going to be able to see just walking through your field. And here's what those kernels look like between those two hybrids. So again, 16K01 on top, big, heavy kernels, average 64,000 kernels per bushel. Again, that's hidden yield potential that we likely won't see just evaluating ears. Compared on the bottom there, 16Q82, average 81,000 kernels per bushel. Lighter kernels, but again, that particular hybrid throws a lot more kernels. So I talked a lot about environments and the differences between hybrids, but how does management play into all that? And that is where I'm going to turn it over to Steve. He'll dive a little bit deeper into that.
Thank you, Brad. Good morning, everyone. I'll start off and apologize a little bit. I am getting over a cold, so bear with me. I hope my voice holds out for the duration of our time here this morning. But I wanted to continue on with what Brad had shared from what we do in R&D and then take it and parlay it to what a lot of myself and my team does with many of you and our customers out in the field. And that's we do what we call these genetic by environment by management trials, which we've kind of denoted as GEM trials. And this past year, what we've done is we've taken this a little bit step farther, and we have usually in the past we'll stop when the combine runs and we'll have our yield, we'll have our test weight, and we're going to have our moisture. But this year, we wanted to understand the yield components a little bit better. So we started to look at kernel number, kernel size, kernel weight. And that's a little bit about what I'd like to share with you here on the next couple of slides. So to start off this morning, I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of the trial. Many of you know O2K39 has been a very good hybrid for us for many, many years. We're starting to transition out of it, and we launched two new 101 and 103-day hybrids to help replace it. So we thought it'd be really good to have a steady eddy hybrid with two new ones to really try to look at yield components and management responses. So we set up a trial, and the one we want to focus on here today will just give you a little bit of a view of how our fertility and stuff looked. Planter applied, we put some stuff down in furrow. We did a 5-25. We added an extra gallon of a potassium acetate, added a little bit of micros to help us out. We put down roughly around 70-75 pounds of nitrogen early on, good source of phosphorus, good source of potassium, and some sulfur. We came back in at V8, put down another 40 gallons of a 28005 mix. So all in all, we're sitting around 190-ish pounds of nitrogen for what we would call a standard. We feel for this given area where we did this trial, that was very comparable to what growers in the area do. Then we decided to come back in and what we call our enhanced, we start to do a little bit more. And in this case, the soils in this area have problems with fusarium, crown rots are type of a big issue. So we put in the Xyway product in the 2x0 band. Then also in the V8 side dress, we were having some sap samples come back that showed we were deficient in potassium. So we put some of that in, and then as we get ready for the pollination process, we made sure that we were sufficient with boron. So we threw in a quart an acre. And then in this particular area, we just continued to get rain, and we were seeing some nitrogen deficiency stresses. So in a rescue attempt on the enhanced trial, we went back in and we put down about another 30 pounds of nitrogen with a few pounds of sulfur. Then at tassel time, we did Mirvis Neo, 13.7 ounces. We did put in a plant growth regulator, a cytokinin at 8 ounces per acre. And still, our tissue samples and our sap samples were saying we were low on potassium. So we threw in yet another gallon of potassium acetate. So 3 different shots of that along the way. Throughout the course of the year, we were also taking drone images, satellite images, and really tracking these fields, this one in particular. And we were seeing pretty sizable differences aerially, and we were also seeing that at the ground level. So I'll share a couple of pictures with us here. At 3 different points in the growing season, we could see differences through the NDVI. We could also see sizable differences when we walked fields when we were looking at things. The middle picture to me is one of the most interesting because that was taken the day that we figured the corn black layered. Pretty green corn for a northern climate for black layered corn. So we thought we'd see pretty sizable yield differences. We'll show in the next couple of slides. We didn't actually see as big of a difference as we were thinking, but sometimes yield doesn't tell the whole story. Late season agronomics are important. And we saw significant differences on our late season standability. I want to say the final picture on the right there was taken probably somewhere around the first week of November, a few days prior to harvest. Okay, so as we got to the harvest season, we took a handful of ears and we started to, again, we want to look at the yield components. So we were breaking ears open, doing our ear counts. One of the things that we really started to like zone in on is what is our kernel size? So on 2 of the 3 hybrids here, the 2 new ones are 01U74 and our 03U08. We didn't really know what to expect with them being new, but we thought we had maybe a little bit of a deeper kernel with the 01U, a little bit of a fatter kernel with the 03U. But again, we're learning, and we wanted to see how this would then translate into our yield metrics. Now, the one product that we've known for quite some time, we've had good success with, is the O2K39. And for many of us that are familiar with this product or who have planted in the past, we know this potentially is the largest kernel hybrid that we certainly sell in the earlier RMs and sometimes across the entire company. And that's exactly what we saw too. So this would be some of the kernels that I picked out, and some of them had a hard time sitting on my thumb. So we figured we had a strong opportunity to really push yield, and that was going to come through what we would call a kernel size and kernel flex. All right, let's break this down a little bit more. So as we're looking at the yield components, one of the things that really stood out to us is we had, different yields across the 3 different hybrids, but the response to management was variable. The O1U didn't show a huge response. The O2K showed a pretty moderate one, and the O3U was a little bit suspect. Okay, but when we start to break down and we look at the yield components, we started to learn a few things when you look at the kernels per bushel and the kernels per ear. And one of the first things to me that jumps out is if we think back to the slides that Brad was showing earlier, when we're looking at 3 hybrids here that are under 65-ish thousand bushels or kernels per bushel, this shows that we actually had very good grain fill. We had very large kernels. The notion that we have data that now suggests that we can get kernels under 60,000 is something new to me. That's not something I've seen in the past. We've got a nice data set that we're working on that shows we can actually do that. It's very sizable yield as well. And it's interesting to look at how the different hybrids create yield, because there's a trade-off between the kernels per bushel, kernels per ear as well. So typically, the more kernels on the ear typically reduces kernel size. I think we can all know and understand that. And that's simply because we have limited resources to fill the extra kernels. But if we break down each of these 3 hybrids and we put some notes and stuff on them, we felt that with the O1U74, we actually had really good ear flex, but we didn't always have the resources, at least in this scenario, to get the kernel flex. If we mix and match that and compare it with O2K39, we've known over the years that if we have the available resources to keep the kernels, we can get significantly large kernels. And finally, with the O3U08, it showed that it was moderate. We had the ability to kind of flex it both ways and at both capacities. So with the 2 new hybrids here that are going to be very strong staples in our lineup going forward, it's nice to know this, and we're going to continue to build on this in the future as we look at things going forward. So I want to pause the conversation here a little bit around this trial. We'll come back and revisit it in a couple of slides down the road, but we spent a lot of time talking about kernel size, kernels per ear. I want to pivot now and have a conversation around test weight, because test weight a lot of times gets thrown into this conversation, and I think we need to understand what it means. So I'd like to pose the question, and it's a true or false. And the question reads, does higher test weight corn necessarily mean more yield potential? A lot of times, if we listen to high yield corn growers talk, or just people in general, we'll continually hear, I had 280, 300-pound corn and it weighed 65 pounds. Or on the flip side, we hear people say, I need my corn to weigh like lead. And sometimes I think there's a little bit of a misconception around what's actually going on there. So we'll give it a couple of more seconds here to get our quiz question out and look at that. So we're 75% is saying false, 25% is saying true. That's a good breakdown. So a few of us have a couple of things to learn here going forward. Where I want to start this conversation around test weight is just to simply take a step back and examine what is test weight. Okay, so when we think about a bushel, we can refer to a bushel in 2 different capacities. First, a bushel is essentially a volumetric measurement, like a bushel basket, which typically is around 9.3 gallons in volume. And when we talk about test weight, grain storage, grain transportation, or maybe what I would term as just the logistics, okay, that was when we term and refer to the volumetric bushel. But there's also a bushel in which we can talk about, and that is weight. Okay, and weight in terms of a bushel of corn is 56 pounds. For our different grains, there's different weight units. okay? And we use this to determine yield and to determine grain sales. If we look at the picture on the right-hand corner, you can see two different volumes of corn. I should say that wrong. We see the same volume of corn on a scale, but we see two different weights. And what we can see is on the picture on the left, we've got the same amount of kernels, but we're weighing, if you can't see it, is 58.4 grams. On the right, again, we've got the same amount of grain, but we're weighing 54.7 grams. So while the amount of the grain is the same, the weight can be very different. And that simply goes back to the size of our kernels. And also it can be attributed to the weight of the kernels. Okay, so big kernels don't always mean big yields, and vice versa. Low kernels don't always mean low yields. But I think the take-home message here is, on general, the larger the kernels, typically the lower test weight we'll have because there's less that can fit into a volumetric area. On the flip side, the smaller the kernels tend to be the heavier test weight products that we can have. Now, we oftentimes get the question, is there correlations between the two? And the answer is no, they're not correlated. Test weight and yield, as the graph shows, virtually have no synergy, no correlation. What our graph here shows is you can have essentially low 50-pound test weight corn, and you can have 300 bushel corn in doing so. On the flip side, you could have 65-pound test weight corn and have 150 bushel corn, or vice versa. So test weight and yield are not correlated, and test weight and kernel weight are also not correlated. And I think that's something key to understand, because a lot of times when myself and my team talk with growers around yield, there's always this conundrum of test weight matters. And yes, it does. We'll talk about where and when. But when it comes to yield, we need kernel weight. Kernel weight should take precedence every single time. Okay, so I want to show this graph one more time that Brad showed earlier. We've got a strong correlation between grain yield and kernel weight. And again, that is not the case when it comes to yield and test weight. I want to go back now and revisit the earlier trial that we did with the genetics by environment by management, because we did additional work from what we showed you, and that's what we want to showcase here. In addition to the parameters of yield and the metrics of kernel per bushel and kernels per ear, we also dried the grain, shelled it, and we started to take what is our weight on a kernel basis. So what this shows is we have 3 different hybrids, and we give them different ratings for test weight in our book. Okay, the O1U and the O3U, we give 2 ratings, which for us means they're going to be pretty solid test weight corns. But for many of us that have known O2K, the test weight is not a strength. We rated it a 5, and in many instances, it's one of the lower test weight hybrids that we sell in our company. However, we also know and we've shown that the kernel size is substantially different. In this case, about 15 to 16% larger in terms of weight. So if we look at our kernel weight in grams per 1,000 kernels, we are at least 15% higher with O2K than the other two. And to me, that's what really helps drive and elevate yield with this particular product. And it doesn't mean that we can't be successful with the other two. We certainly will. But this is how we get top end yields with the hybrid, such as O2K39. And as Brad alluded to earlier, we've got plenty of other hybrids in our lineup that also have large kernels. This past year, we got to look at 12U11 on the mid to full season. That's going to be another very large kerneled hybrid. We had a few new advancements this year in our M series that also follow suit in that as well. So if you see a rating that's low test weight, don't always run from that, because I do think there's an opportunity that we can do some pretty neat things from a management standpoint simply because of kernel size, and then making those kernels weigh as much as we possibly can. A personal story here, as Julia alluded to kind of on the onset, O2K has been our most successful entry into the corn growers, I think dating back to 2019. And a couple growers that have used that and who have experienced success, they're getting that yield primarily because of kernel size and kernel weight. And this past year, when we were doing one of the entries that we had on mine and my parents' farm, when we were running the combine through, I grabbed a handful of ears, looked at them. 16 by 32 is about what they were. We planted a population of just at 40,000. And it came out that our kernels were weighing about 400 grams per thousand, and that's quite substantial. And again, that's what's driving the yield of this hybrid. So while it has low test weight, I'm also not sure I care, because as long as I'm above 54, I don't get docked, but I could really crank yield on the kernel size metrics. And to me as a grower, that's the most important thing for myself. So before we start to transition and move on from the test weight conversation, I want to just hit a few points more to make sure that we're clear on some of this. Test weight is really important and has its place, but the factors that really included are kernel size and kernel shape. And the larger the kernel, typically the smaller we're going to have, or the lower test weight we'll have. The dryness, the kernel density, the amount of starch that we also have in the kernels can have a huge factor in what our test weight is, as well as the slickness of just how much, again, we can pack into a volumetric area. Okay, all these are affected by our genetics. They can be affected by how the crop grows, management, and ultimately, when you get to the end of the season, how the crop is dried for storage. In many cases, we do find ourselves in situations where we have low test weight, and some of it is genetics, but some of it can be outside of it. If we have disease, if we have drought situations occur, early frosts will do a lot of damage. You guys could see it's not rocket scientists. The wetter the corn, the lower the test weight, and that's because when you have high moisture corn, it dries, it shrinks. And again, I want to make the point that starch is denser than water, and that's a key driver of this. To look at the same graph in terms of numbers, if it's easier for us, if we've got 28% corn and we take that down to 15%, we can expect about a 4-pound increase in test weight. If we have drier corn, if we start shelling at about a 20%, we'll still pick up about two or more pounds when the grain gets dried. So, that is not that's important for us from a standpoint of drying our corn, putting it in the bin, and for longevity and for quality. But that doesn't equate to more yield coming out of the field. All right, so where does test weight have its biggest play? For us, and I think everyone probably knows this, is it's the logistics of farming. Okay, it's transportation, it's storage, it's longevity of the storage, and it could be the quality of our grain as well. So we just ran through a quick example here. Let's say we've got an 80,000 bushel storage unit grain bin, and we've got two different test weights. One of them is going to be 60 pounds, and I think the other will be a little bit below. And how do those numbers pair and match up? So in this case, if we've got 80,000 bushels to go into our 80,000 bushel bin, and it's 60 pounds per bushel, that comes out to be 4.8 million pounds of grain. Okay, if we divide that by what a bushel is of 56 pounds, we come in at 85,714 bushels. It means we need some, we've got a lot of good crop there. On the flip side, what if we've got it at 54 pounds instead of 60? Now we've got 4.3 million pounds of grain. If we do our math, divide that by a bushel, which is 56, we're down to 77,000 pounds, and that's a difference or a delta of 8,571. Okay, so we do have differences here, and this is the value of test weight, and this is how we should be thinking about it. We've got a few minutes left here, and I want to spend the last of our time here talking about a subject that we call phantom yield loss. And as we're preparing for this presentation, we thought there's a need and a reason to talk about corn dry down, not just in terms of what it can do from kernel size, kernel weight, test weight, but also what does it do to the last half of yield? Many of us have opened up fields, we've combined it, we come back 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, and the yield is significantly different. And every year we have conversations around this of what happens, where does the yield go? How can this be the case? It's 20, 30 bushel better just a few weeks ago. And that's a question that we've posed to ourselves, and we've done a lot of research both internally, and we've aligned with third-party universities as well to help address and to answer the question. And we thought it had a play here because what we found with some of our work is there is a kernel component, kernel size, kernel weight component here that we'd like to discuss and share. So a couple of years ago, we ran some studies across 4 well-known hybrids of ours in the general 110-day RM across 3 different locations. We did one in Clinton, Illinois, one in Slater, Iowa, and then one in Seward, Nebraska. And the graph in front of us is showing our dry down rates. And I think all of us would look at this and say, well, that makes a lot of sense. If I give corn 45, 50 days to dry down, of course, it's going to get drier. And that's exactly what we saw. Where things start to get a little bit more interesting, though, is when we look at the yield responses that go along with the different harvest dates. So we have our 3 different locations here, and each location shows generally a little different data set, but the trend, for the most part, tells me 2 things. One, it's fair to say that we lose bushels as harvest gets delayed. You guys see it, we see it, and in our work, this study, we saw approximately 9 bushel loss over a 30-day window. We've also saw similar yield losses across hybrids as well, but there is some difference, and there can be a little bit of variance across hybrids. Then we're going to come to this slide right here. And this is where things really get interesting. Even though we saw about a 9 bushel yield loss across hybrids and across locations, when we started to look at the individual metrics around the kernel, we actually saw that the kernel weight was maintained across all of our harvest moistures. And if you look at some of these graphs and data, you could actually draw the conclusion that we had a slight gain. And there are some university studies that are starting to show the same thing. So if we feel we're losing yield, but our kernel weight is being maintained to potentially slight increase, where is that yield loss coming from? And that's a question that we'll continue to have going forward, but we feel that we have a strong enough data set here, as well as with others in the academics across the Corn Belt, that we're quite confident in saying that kernel weight respiration is not a factor in what we call phantom yield loss, which means we need to start to look elsewhere or in other areas when we want to examine where is this phantom yield loss, as we call it, coming from, because we're pretty certain it's not kernels. And that to me it took many years and a lot of work to get a good data set to show that. But it also leaves the question for the rest of us now is, okay, if this isn't the case, then where is it? What is it? And where do we need to look and focus our next efforts on? And that, I think, we will leave to a different point in time. So as we start to conclude here and wind down and get ready for some questions, we did have 4 key takeaways that we thought we'd like to leave you with here this morning. The first one revolves around the fact that kernels per ear and kernel weights could both be correlated to yield. However, test weight is not correlated to yield, but test weight is very important for, again, what we call the logistics of farming, specifically hauling, storage, and the longevity of the storage. Corn hybrids inherently flex in different ways, and different stresses along with different managements can really positively or negatively affect how these hybrids react and the kernel numbers and or the kernel weight. I'm really happy, and I feel we have a better pulse on our golden harvest hybrids of how they create yield and how we have to manage them to make sure that we know the tricks of the trade with each of them. I'll spend a lot of time looking at other competitive type products and trying to determine and figure out where yields created. And it's quite a bit tougher when you talk with some other people to help understand what drives it. I feel we have a really good view of how that works for us. Okay, kernel weight, kernel size, its hidden yield potential, and its big yield potential. Brad showed some great graphs and some numbers. If we can take our kernel weight and we can increase it just a few milligrams per kernel, it's huge bushels. And that's something that I think we can all capitalize on in our farming practices. And finally, lower yields from delayed harvest. It's not coming from kernel respiration. Is it coming from our combine eating it? Is our yield monitor not calibrated? That's yet to be determined. But we're quite certain that the kernel in and of itself is not the reason for the loss of yield. So with that, Julia, that was my last slide. I'm going to turn it back over to yourself to wrap us up here, and then we'll take any questions afterwards.
Yeah, appreciate it, Steve and Brad. Wow, what a great morning that we've spent kind of talking through the yield components here. With that being said, Brad, Steve, feel free to come off of mute and turn your videos on. Steve, looks like we have our first question here, and then encourage everyone to get some things posted. Is the difference in the harvest photos of your case study for the standard versus enhanced management were significant? What added steps do you think had the most impact on what we see there in terms of the photos?
Leaching of nitrogen. What I was probably most surprised about is if you start, it's like you and I every single day. We wake up in the morning, we're hungry, we eat. And if we don't eat the rest of the day, we're not going to feel real good, even though we had a big breakfast. So we started off solid, but then stresses of the year, leaching of nutrients, specifically nitrogen, you started to see separations. And then as we got to the grain fill period, I would say in some of the photos and some of the hybrids, the extra management likely wasn't economical. But I always challenge people, if you got down corn and you're running your combine one way at 2 miles an hour versus going through your field, what does harvest efficiency look like? To me, higher yielding corn pays most of the time in terms of yield, but usually all of the time in terms of how to manage an operation. So a long way to answer that, but to me, it was the stress of nitrogen from endless rains we had this year.
Thanks, Steve. Question here around the phantom yield loss trials, Brad. When it comes to weighing those trials, do you use scales or do you use a yield monitor? Was kind of the question in the chat there.
So for the phantom yield loss trials, those were done using research combines, which actually they don't utilize a yield monitor. They have a physical scale that all the grain from the entire plot goes in that scale and gets weighed. And that's what we would calculate the yield off of. But for the kernel weight, we would take a sample of each one of those plots and we would physically count out 1,000 kernels and weigh those kernels. So that was manually done. So we know that the kernel weight did not change. We physically measured kernel weight. It did not change across harvest dates, but our yield with our combine did go down. We saw a yield decrease from the combine. It was not from kernel weight, which means it had to be from something else. It could have been from dropped ears, more lodged plants, probably some shelling from the head from the drier corn. Could be from any one of those.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. You answered another question that was in the chat. If yield loss is not coming from kernel respiration, where do we suspect it's coming from? So thank you for also addressing that there. One other question on phantom yield loss in the chat is what phantom yield loss, or it says 0.3 bushels per day loss after what percent moisture?
I think that would have been averaged across the entire harvest date. So I think we started, mid-September, ended late October. So on average across those harvest dates, it was roughly 0.3 bushel per day. I think it was regardless of moisture.
Okay. Thank you, Brad. Shifting gears a little bit back to test weight. So if I'm feeding cattle, will I get more starch out of a high test weight corn or more kernels in a lower test weight corn for feed?
Julia,
Are you the cattle expert, again? Steve?
No, I would repeat the question again. I'm getting my wits back with me.
Yeah. So in feeding cattle, will I get more starch out of a high test weight corn or more kernels out of or is it better to get more kernels out of a low test weight corn for feed?
I'm gonna take a rain check and get back.
Okay.
That's an answer I should know. I apologize. It's not
Not a
with you
problem.
this morning.
The person, I'll type into the question to try to get the name of the individual that submitted that was anonymous. As of right now, that's our last question in the queue. So we'll give it one more minute here. If there's any other questions you want to pose to Steve or Brad, we can take that here with the remainder of our time. Steve, I guess I have a personal question, and maybe this is one that we can land on. You had mentioned that you did some SAP testing on your trial sets there this summer. I guess just your recommendations around SAP testing and maybe when to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So I started doing SAP about 3 years ago, and it was basically out of frustration where I was at an end with tissue sampling. It wasn't telling me anything more. I wasn't getting more out of it. I didn't know what to do with it, and I wanted a deeper look into the plant. So, SAP isn't without challenges because I feel that area is getting built as it goes. But the thing that I like about SAP is it'll tell me what's in the plant. I can also figure out what's in the soil, and it gives me a more holistic look and view of what's in the plant. This past year was really challenging to me, as we know that a plant can take up about twice, or I should say 50% more potassium than it needs. But I always kept coming back deficient in potassium. And it's hard to say because like you don't know when or how that plant's going to allocate its reserves or why it's holding it. So I get some frustrations with it, but to me, it gives me the best view that I know of now. Probably next to doing something like a sugar bricks might give me a little bit better view, but I don't have access to that. So it's expensive, but it's the closest thing that I can find to like taking a blood sample, seeing what's in the plant and what needs to be in for the future. And the nice thing about doing it for a couple of years with the same hybrid is you can start to pick up on trends of where you think you should be at certain growth stages, and then what you have to do to, to get the nutrient not just applied to the field, but into the plant at the right point in time. And that creates a whole different set of logistical challenges, but it works. I mean, it works well. The fields I have the best success on, I pull sap starting at V6. Then I'll do one right before tassel. Always come back deficient on boron. And then I'll do one about R3. And usually at that point in time, as you get into grain fill, everything's low, which is the next frontier, I suppose.
Awesome. Thanks for that explanation and kind of expansion there on SAP. With that, we are at time and we don't have any additional questions in the Q&A. And so I just want to take this time to thank you all. If there are more questions that pop up or you want to rewatch this webinar on the Golden Harvest website and you have questions, please feel free to connect with your local agronomist and or reach out to anyone on the panel here today. So with that, appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us this Thursday morning. We hope to see you back next Thursday, and we hope you have a great and safe day. So thank you all.